Hey everybody, it's Candy, aka Brown Eyed Girl 69. Well, this is the last chapter of the book Mr. Wolf and Me. So, I hope y'all really liked the book up to this point. If you've been following along, the last chapter is called Then Unraveling. It wasn't that I wanted to die, it was more that I couldn't imagine how it would be to live anymore. Mr. Wolf hadn't been my first pet. We had a really prickly cat once, when I was little, that stayed until I was crazy about him and then just walked away. I'd been through gerbils and guinea pigs too, and even a white rat which Mom never would have permitted except for my ruptured appendix. But Mr. Wolf was different. Mr. Wolf was like the other half of me. While I was teaching him, he kind of taught me too. We understood each other, or I thought I understood him, until I saw him out there at Jordan Aggers's like that. The car was even quieter going back home than it had been on our trip out there. When Sheriff Cravens pulled up in our driveway, Dad asked him to come in and have some coffee and warm himself up. The sheriff just shook his head. "I don't think you need me around here today." Dad nodded and leaned against the sheriff's side of the car. "Thanks for doing all you could for us, Jim." Then he turned to me. "How about you, Miles?" I nodded, and Sheriff Cravens looked at me searchingly. "Anything you want to tell me, son?" What was there to tell him? That I knew who had turned those animals loose at Fletcher's the night before, because I was pretty sure I did. Or that I'd been lying all the time about the groundhog and was ready to admit that Mr. Wolf was a bad dog from the start. "You wouldn't want to hear it," I told him. "Try me," he said. "Mr. Wolf was cut up by a groundhog on Thursday," I said stubbornly. "No matter how come he was out there last night, he was with me on Thursday afternoon." Mom had opened the storm door and was waving out at us. She had on that rose-colored housecoat with the pocket that always hangs down because she catches it on doorknobs. She kept waving until Sheriff Cravens waved back, and then she waved even harder. "What do you suppose is on her mind?" Dad asked. He started up the walk while I watched Sheriff Cravens turn his car around in the drive to be ready to pull out. When he got to the door and spoke to Mom, Dad turned around and waved too, and yelled something I couldn't hear over the sound of the motor. The sheriff frowned and rolled down the window so he could hear. "What's up?" he shouted. "Just kill your motor and come in," Dad yelled. He had a funny sound to his voice. "You too, Miles," he added. It must have looked silly to let him the way I was standing out there, just letting my clothes turn white with snow. I saw him the minute I reached the door. I stopped so suddenly that Sheriff Cravens right behind me almost knocked me down. Mom had put a beach towel on the breakfast room floor, pushing the table and chairs back against the wall to make room. It was weird, the way he was lying there, just the way that other dog had. Everything, the angle of his ears, the way his legs were crossed at the ankle, the bright silver markings in the deep black of his coat. Only Mr. Wolf had his head up so that you could see, down on the left side of his neck, that shaved-off place where Doc Fletcher had sewed him up. His underbelly was matted with dirt and filth like he'd come a long way, and maybe even swum through mire to get there. His breath was deep, and even in exhausted sleep. "He woke me up scratching at the door," Mom explained. "How do you suppose he even got away from the vet's? When I found your note, I guess you'd heard he was out and gone to look for him. Poor fella, he must have wanted to come home awfully bad." The three of us stared at him so stupidly that her own face began to look fearful. "What's wrong?" she asked breathlessly. Then she reached out and grabbed at my jacket without taking her eyes from Dad's face. "There's nothing wrong," she decided out loud. "There's absolutely nothing wrong, and you know it." Her voice was suddenly sharp and cross the way it gets when she is afraid. The warmth of the kitchen when Mr. Wolf lying there safely asleep, plus the sound of Mom being herself, was too much for me. I couldn't help it. I began to laugh. "Nothing," I shouted, grabbing her. "Nothing in the whole wide world." When I took a hold of her, some of the snaps on her housecoat popped open. She snatched at her clothes and darted an embarrassed glance at Sheriff Cravens. "You quit mauling me, Miles Orton," she said crossly, "and clean that snow off your feet before you ruin my kitchen. Both of you," she added fiercely, glaring at Dad. But we were all past being bullied by then. Dad looked at Sheriff Cravens, and they both burst into laughter along with me. Dad took Mom by the shoulders. She couldn't fight him because she was still trying to get her snaps fastened up on that silly house coat. Dad just backed her off gently into a chair. "We have a long, strange story to tell you," he said quietly. "And while Miles tells it, I'll make us some coffee." She started up, but he shook his head. "I was making coffee for Jim Cravens and me when you were still in junior high," he reminded her. "And that was over a campfire, which is a lot harder than doing it here." "I should think so," she said tartly. "The pot is already full, and you know where the cups are." The noise and confusion awakened Mr. Wolf. I heard the slow, easy thump of his tail, and he whimpered a little. I knelt down by him and stroked his head to assure him that everything was all right. His nose felt hot and dry to my touch, and he smelled of the medicine that Dr. Fletcher had used on his wounds. I don't know what had made Dad think I could tell Mom where we'd been and what we'd seen. Sheriff Cravens knew I couldn't do it because he started in about Jordan Agger's having called him a little after midnight. He wanted me to come out right then and bring Miles along. I persuaded him to wait until dawn at least. "But why did you have to take him at all?" Her anger was gone, and she sounded kind of sick as she took the mug of coffee Dad had poured for her. It was only then that I realized that here she was, truly wide awake, and it was only a little after 7. Jordan felt that Miles would be able to take Mr. Wolf's death better if he saw why it had to happen. "Are you trying to tell me that he put Miles through that awful experience out of kindness? A little boy like Miles?" "Miles had taken on this fight like a man, and he has stayed by Mr. Wolf like a man. He deserved to take the punishment the same way," Dad told her. "And as for Jordan being kind," Sheriff Craven said quietly, "who knows what that boy is really like inside, or how he would have been if he'd been raised without an empty stomach and a horsewhip on his backside every time his dad hit the sauce." I was down on the beach towel with Mr. Wolf's head up on my knee, but I saw that soft look coming on Mom's face. Mr. Wolf was alive and safe. The churning in my stomach had gone, leaving me only a sickly, sour taste in my mouth. More than anything, I wanted things back like they'd been before that whole miserable thing had begun, and that included having Mom act like her same old feisty self again. "I go hungry a lot of times myself," I said in a tone of mock bravery. "I can only stand it because I know what she has to feed me weekends when Dad is around." Mom's mouth flew open, and I expected a yell of protest, but then the corner of her mouth tucked down. "He's right," she said meekly. "I won't even buy liniment for the chain marks on his ankles, and I rub salt in the places where I pinch him with pliers." Dad chuckled because it must have sounded like home to him too. The Sheriff Craven wasn't even listening. He was blowing softly into his coffee mug and frowning at the ripples he made. "Brothers," Sheriff Craven said thoughtfully. "That's how it had to be. Those 2 dogs must have been full brothers. I just wonder if there are any more out there somewhere." Dad and I stared at him. "It all fits together," he said quietly. "Look back on what we know. We had almost enough clues to figure it out from the first. Jordan shot a shepherd like this in late April. Thought he killed it, but never found the dead animal. He never said whether it was a male or female because he probably couldn't tell in the bad light and the excitement of the fray. It had to be a mother dog, and she had to have had made it back to her cave and her litter. How old would you say that pup was when you found him, Miles?" I shook my head. "Just little. He hardly knew how to drink." The sheriff nodded. "Weakened by the shot and unable to hunt, she probably just died later there in the cave with her pups. If they were fast on their feet at all, they would have wandered off, like your Mr. Wolf did, looking for water and food, insects, and small game. That other dog had to be a full brother. Why is the spit image of Mr. Wolf here? It still doesn't make sense to me, Mom protested. These aren't run-of-the-pack dogs. Why would a purebred be out in those woods wild in the first place? Who fathered the pups? Mr. Wolf and his brother had to have a father just like themselves to be so perfectly marked. Sheriff Craven shook his head. You ought to get a look in my files to stop those questions. We get letters and calls and reward notices all the time for lost dogs. People sell dogs and the dogs go searching for their old masters. Animals wander away from campsites or jump out of cars in strange places. I'd bet somebody somewhere has a file that shows a bred shepherd missing early this year, say January or February. After a while, people give up looking, knowing how dangerous the roads are for runaway pets. But the mother was wild, Mom insisted. She was running with the pack and killing lambs just like the others. We call that feral, Sheriff Craven said. When a tame animal turns into the wild, it is feral. A mother animal will find food for herself and her young with a desperation you wouldn't believe she had. You have to remember that dogs were wild animals a lot more centuries than they have been domesticated. Would Mr. Wolf have been wild like that if I hadn't found him? I asked, feeling a little sick at the thought. Sure as anything, he said. He just lucked into it with you. Like I did with him, I stated proudly. I think you ought to be the one who gets to tell Jordan Eggers how this all has turned out, he added. Oh, I don't want to, I said quickly. Still have hard feelings against him? The sheriff asked. I shook my head. It's more that I feel bad. It's like he said, I had everything to win, and he had nothing but losing. I wouldn't quite buy that, Sheriff Craven said. He won a little yesterday, and he was bright enough to realize it, and fair enough to admit he was wrong. How can you say that? My mind was suddenly full again of all that awful scene in the sheep pen. Austin, the sheriff said briskly. When Austin came forward of his own accord and stood by Eggers' story against yours, Eggers got a new insight into this jerkwater town. So did I admitted quietly, remembering how it felt when the weight of evidence had turned against me. So what am I supposed to say to him? I asked when Dad handed me the phone. We have confidence in you, Miles, Mom said in that half-kidding, sarcastic way of hers. You'll think of something. One thing about the people around our house, they've all been brought up right, if you'll excuse the immodesty. While I was looking up the number in the book, Dad refilled the coffee cups and suggested they go try the new firewood that he and I had brought in the day before. By the time I dialed the number and heard that broken country ring of the Eggers phone, there was nobody in the kitchen except Mr. Wolf, who was asleep again, and me. When I finally hung up, I laid a dog biscuit right down by Mr. Wolf's nose in case he waked up while I was in the other room. Then I took a glass of milk in by the fire with the others. Mom angled her eyebrows at Dad. That's the fellow who is always raging at me about being long-winded on the phone. Jordan was telling me about growing up on that place out there, I explained, and about how when he was a kid he got some really good clues to the mystery of that ghostly drummer. Since nobody said anything and I could do without their wise, pleased looks, I rolled over on my stomach and stared into the fire. In fact, it was really too exciting to keep to myself. Next spring, when the ground clears, Jordan and Mr. Wolf and me are going to track down some of those clues for ourselves. At the mention of his name, Mr. Wolf stirred from his sleep. We could all hear the slow, heavy thump of his tail on the kitchen floor. That lump came back in the back of my throat again. Only different this time. And that, my friends, is the book Mr. Wolf and Me by Mary Frances Shura. And the art done by Conrad Hack, of all the pictures that I've posted. This book came out in 1979. I was 10 years old. And the reason why I got it to read again was to see if I could get that feeling that I knew I had all those years ago when I read it back then. Well, yes, I can say without a doubt that the emotions and the feelings that I felt reading this book 45 years ago are the same emotions and feelings that I got reading it at the age of 55. It still kind of bums me out that that letter that I wrote to Mary Frances never reached her. She was definitely an inspiration, for sure. I've always been told that I need to write a book. Well, maybe one day I will. And it might be sooner than I think. But I appreciate y'all stopping by and listening to me read this book. If y'all are interested in me getting any other books and reading them out loud, let me know. I think I'm down for it. It just depends on how many chapters it is. Because this is 10 chapters. And it took me basically a month to read the book. Simply because I have other things going on in my life right now. But I knew I needed to finish this book because the book is due back actually today, the library, and I finished it just in time. So, much love, peace, love, hugs, nugs, and to everybody that has given me the support and following thus far. Y'all have a blessed day, afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. And until the next time, I'm out of here.